Hi, I'm Larry Butler for the East Hawai'i Cultural Center, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce our exhibiting artist, Douglas Diaz, and his show Grief. And thank you so much for being here with us and agreeing to talk to us about your work.
Thank you, Larry.
We've got work on the wall, we have work in progress, and it's just really all fascinating. Douglas got his master's in architecture from Columbia University, and he studied studio art at California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland, and he's also studied with a master in Japan, and has exhibited widely in the US and in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. And he's also had an extensive teaching career, and he's taught at a number of major art schools. He's taught at Parsons and Columbia, Pratt, Rensselaer Polytechnic, and Bennington College, where he's taught, I understand, architecture and design.
Yes.
And thank you so much for being here. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. The show is called Grief, and what I was interested in doing in starting this work is really this ability to express something that was happening to me very personally through a series of relationships and things that were happening at the time. Unfortunately, I lost a really special person to me, and it was at the moment of the pandemic, right when the pandemic was starting. And so there's a series of I think moments that culminated in trying to understand how to process grief. And one of the key things of that is that grief can be very isolating. And as a process, I was interested in figuring out, maybe even desperate, to figure out a way to express it in the sense that it would connect to others. And I think that kind of collective sharing of that experience helps it become cathartic and a little bit more meaningful. So that is the general inspiration, if you will, of the work, and why I even started painting and doing this show around grief. It also connects very deeply to how I think about what art is and what it means to me. And I'm less interested in, for example, the historical or even academic side of art, and I'm interested in more the self-expression and how you use it as a way to process information, process experience, and then develop really a kind of complete sense of living in an experience, rather than saying, I'm an artist with a capital A. Less interested in that. So my work tends to be very direct. It tends to be, I hope it is very clear. And when it isn't, I think of it as the culmination or the challenges that is faced through the act of dealing with an emotion. So grief is a perfect example of that, because grief is in itself is something that we tend to experience, right? All in our lifetimes, we have people and loved ones that pass away, or animals that pass away. But the ways that we're educated or in society kind of raised to address grief is very shallow and flat. Right? And so we kind of tend to be in this thing where we just simply don't want to engage it. It's very challenging. It forces you to become vulnerable. And in general, I think we have I shouldn't say we, because I'm projecting onto others, but I had a very difficult and challenging experience with it. I didn't know where to put my emotions. I didn't know how to express it. So this work is this journey of trying to figure that out. And in particular, this piece is probably a good place to start.
Okay.
We can talk about this as we go along, but there's in the show there's basically two major bodies of work, one on paper and then one on canvas that I'm actively still painting, but parts that are finished. The work on paper is all driven by a series of poems that I discovered in the act of investigating and researching how other people have dealt with grief. So I stumbled on this practice in Japan, which is usually Zen monks or other people of kind of a certain level of education would write poems. And they would write these things that are death poems. So basically they would write it, and then shortly after they would pass away.
These are the jisei.
Jisei. Keep always forgetting how do you pronounce it. And this particular one is the person just simply wrote dream. And it's a very fascinating story for me, because I don't know if it's just simply that the poet wrote dream and passed away, or was that the only word that he intended to write. But when I thought about it very deeply and I contemplated for weeks on this poem, I thought, wow, what an incredible way to process what happens when you pass away, right? That we go into this dreamlike state. It also made me think a lot about the relationship between day and night, and how we sometimes escape into this dream world. And so it immediately flipped the tables on the idea of grief. It didn't become this pessimistic, dark, sad burden, but it actually became this playful space in which to engage life and how we live. And if you will, right, the relationship between dreaming and being awake is two sides of a coin. And I think that's very much how we should begin to look at life and death. Right? We tend to think of death as so terminal. But practically speaking, in terms of the work itself, what I ended up doing was using the calligraphy of how death is actually written in Japanese. And I used it as a motif, almost, if you will, as a portal to then enter the space. Right? So
there's a character in here conceptually.
Conceptually, there's a character that gives structure to the framework of the experience. So there's a lot of subtle things that happen in the layering of the piece that have to do with how I was experiencing the emotions of going through thinking about death as a dream state. But I was also really fascinated because of the word dream, and I tend to think of dreaming as a space that you enter. I was very much interested in thinking of this as almost a gateway. So the contrast between the blankness of the paper and in this very rich space makes it such that it becomes like a doorway, right? An opening within a temple or a house or anything of that sort.
So what's your technique here?
So the technique that I employ in all of the paperworks is very, very similar, but it's very distinct from what I traditionally do, in the sense that I would drop a little bit of paint on it and then use a plastic scraper, and not always a brush, but then I would just scrape the layer until the paint completely dissolved in the paper. And in that process, I started to notice a few really interesting things technically that happen with the ink. And the practice in general when I make art is very self-reflective. So what I mean by that is that as I'm painting, I'm observing what's happening and then I'm responding to it. So these particular geometric shapes, like the dots and the dripping that occur, are moments where the paint itself produces a kind of surface tension, and then the paper absorbs the paint on the edge of the ink, and it absorbs it faster. So if I were to swipe at a particular time, it removes the paint from the inside and then leaves this very faint outline. And that, I began to think of that as not just as a metaphor, but as a very similar experience of how people come into your life or how experiences happen, right? That if you're quick to wash away an experience, it bleeds, but if you sit and meditate with it, they leave these beautiful outlines of what it means to live. So, in some levels, the essence of that is the same essence of the outer shape that is produced.
And they got these little surprises in white. I don't know if the camera can pick that up. But.
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I started, I think it's interesting because there's an incredible coincidence, but I first originally started using white in my work shortly after my brother passed away a few years ago. And I was having a really hard time with depicting my feelings towards him. And my shisho in Japan, like the wise sage that he is, came up to me and gave me white and said, why don't you try using this? And what I quickly realized is that white on white is less about how clear you see the geometry and the shape of it, but is more the abstraction of understanding that it's a presence that's there, but you really have to do a lot of effort to go in, or you have belief and faith. And so what I discovered is that was probably an apt way of describing how I felt about my brother. Right? His physical presence on this planet has passed, but it doesn't mean that I've lost that connection. So I tend to use white sometimes as deep layers to begin. And so what you see, the layering that happens here, and then, but most of the time I tend to use white as the final layer, so you can see in this deep mark. And so from a distance, that line completely disappears. White also has a tendency for me to be a kind of uplifting and moving towards the top. It might be a little bit cheesy, but...
I'm also thinking that in some Asian cultures, white is the color of mourning.
It is, yeah. And it's something that I struggle with because for years I didn't paint with any color, precisely because culturally colors have very, very different meanings. And I think being a Westerner in an Eastern European country, and I'm sorry, not Eastern European, but in Southeast Asia, it's very difficult to always understand the subtleties of culture, but it also forced me to think about what are our commonalities, right? And what are the things that transcend cultural beliefs. And this is once again why this idea of death is really kind of fascinating, because in Asia, death and the relationship to, especially with Zen, it's not this big taboo. In the West, I think we tend to think of mourning and grief and the ending in very particular ways. So how we come up against the idea of grief and mourning is entirely different. And I was raised in this Western tradition where you just don't talk about grief. You go in hiding, you wear black, even though you wear black all the time. You go into seclusion, as opposed to the acknowledgement that death is something that lives with us, right? And it actually colors the way that we live a lot more.
Should we look at some more?
Yeah.
Let's see, what's a good little group for us to look at?
I think because we were just talking about the role that color plays, I think maybe this set of 4 paintings would be a good...
And how should we understand these?
So all of these are still within the same framework of coming from a series of poems. So the piece that we just talked about was really important to kind of frame the way that probably is an easier introduction into how I translated the poems into work, or what it kind of generated and inspired. These are a lot more complex in the sense that graphically they're more dynamic, but they're also really dense, right? And so sometimes I think when people look at abstract art, they have a really hard time getting into it because the visual language is something that people brush up against, and it doesn't have any form of reference, right? It's very unlike a portrait, right? Where we're so used to seeing faces, we can relate very specifically, but when you look at something like this, it becomes very challenging because the entry point or the way that you have access to it is very obscure. And in my work, that is true, like every, I think, abstract artist. But what I was interested in doing in very, very simple terms is to, for example, use this red as a way of describing the intensity and the fear that we engage with something like grief. Like when you're sitting with somebody who you love and they're passing, you quickly go from being afraid for them, but then to being afraid for you. Like what will happen once they're gone. So this particular painting is, layering and layering of me trying to figure out how to best represent the idea of that loss. So in this particular case, the poem is the title of it is "I Would Have Mourned My Loss of Life." So it's a poem in where the person is trying to understand that if life and death were what we come to understand at the end of our lives, you would have done things entirely different.
I see.
So on one level, and this is where I was starting to use text, right? So this says lost, and that describes so much of my experience until I started dealing with grief. And it's a very funny thing, but in order to really appreciate life, you have to also engage with the loss of life. And that gives it a different value. So for me, the pain of losing people is what this painting really becomes about. And ultimately, it also becomes my own fears that I have about what will happen when I pass. Will I have done all the things I wanted to do? Will I have achieved and told everybody that I love them, that I needed to love? So that's the struggle with the work. This one tends to be very, very dark because at the moment that I was doing that, doing this particular piece, I wasn't quite at the level of letting go. I think in these pieces, even though they graphically are much darker in their aesthetic, all of the black sits on a very kind of colorful background. And that colorful background is the way that when you make different choices in your life, they can be very positive. I tend to think of black not necessarily as a negative thing. I think of it as an intensity. So in these particular, like these two pieces, what I'm really interested in is the intensity of how we live. And in this particular piece, you can see there's a color transformation that goes from this dark blue to this aqua, a little bit of yellow, and then it goes gray. So the painting could be read, in this format, like from top down, or it could be read as this filter that frames in the way that we live. So in this particular case, it would be the intensity of how we see the world past this layer.
Would it be fair to say that you're using black almost like calligraphy in East Asian tradition?
Yes, 100%. I try not to talk about it too much because I have so much respect for calligraphy, and the ways that I use it are, to be honest, they bastardize the real beauty of it. But I take a lot of clues from calligraphy. So in calligraphy, the stroke, the speed of the stroke, the angle, the way you twist, all of these things they embed meaning, right? And so they literally take words or characters, and you have to, if you're saying happy, you have to try to manifest that within the way you move to make the line. And that is exactly the same thing that I do. So when I splatter and then swipe, I think very precisely about what that represents. So in my work, you will see, because I tend to work on the floor, which hopefully we'll talk about in a bit, I tend to think of the motion that's pulling towards me as something that is for me. So things that are happening in the world towards me, right? And then the movement that goes out is what I express to the world. And most of my paintings have this tension versus that.
I see.
So they're always in this kind of push and pull relationship. And you'll see this a lot in my work, where there's usually a very specific strong motion that goes down or up. And in this particular case, when it comes down, it is about grounding. It is about feeling that I know where I am, I know who I am at this particular moment. It changes every day, but it's this quest to try to figure out what that means.
Maybe this is a good time to go take a look at your working area.
Yeah. So this is my working space, and then we were just talking about the idea of grounding, and it's kind of silly, but I do work on the floor, right? So, which is something that comes from my relationship working with my master in Japan, but it also has this deeply rooted experience of when I sit down and meditate, then I work. It's easy to just fall into the painting from a seated position. So it also requires a different engagement with the body, because half the time I'm like leaning over it, and I literally would then stand here and and do motions with paints and then add things. I stand up, and it becomes a very physical practice. So the idea of an embodied experience is really, really important. The size of these pieces is also something that's very important for me, because they're almost my height. So it allows me to kind of dive in and walk around it, but also be inside of it at the same time. In this particular piece, which is being made specifically for the exhibition, you can see the work is becoming a lot more linear.
Oh my goodness.
And that linearity is very specifically done so that I can create a narrative. And if you come on this side, Larry, you can begin to see the kind of narrative of going from this depth of an experience and the white as this moment of connection and liberation, to then the pain that might kind of engulf us as you have, because grief isn't a singular emotion that we just stated. It goes up and down, it fades, it comes in sometimes harder and deeper. So then there's the moments where you deeply remember the anguish that is caused by the loss of someone, and then it starts to, in some cases, change, maybe even lift the emotion, and then become something else, and it continues to evolve. So this piece is very specifically the telling of maybe the journey of what I experience in a single day with an emotion, which is almost a microcosm of what happens over a series of months or even years. But I think of it as a day, because if you really focus, and grief has this really particular way of, I was going to say eradicating, but what it does is it wrinkles and it opens up time, where you forget, how much time has passed, because you're so focused on reliving memories or histories with somebody, and then it stretches it, and it feels like an eternity to just make it through one day. And I think that probably has more to do with the ways that we're vulnerable to the regrets, the anguish that we feel, almost a suffocation that happens. But then we also have these really intense moments where we remember what it was like to be touched by a loved one.
And the text here says holding.
Yeah, so the text in here is, it says holding the night. So the person who I lost was a lover, somebody who I love very deeply, and because of it, I often tend to remember what it was like to be with her. And so, the text itself is incredibly personal, even though we just talked about these poems that are, kind of ancient and they're Zen practitioners in Japan a few hundred years ago, the pieces are very much still about this moment, and they're deeply personal.
Let me ask you a little bit about the Japanese roots of your art. You were an architect, you studied architecture, and you got into this, and I understand it's through a Japanese mentor.
Yes. So I ended up in Japan through a series of happenstance circumstances that led me to meeting this person, and I often say that I'm really lucky because it was just complete fortune that I ran into him. And he is a painter, and one day he just, as I was staying at his atelier, he came up to me and said, "Here's paper and pencil, start painting." And it was terrifying. It was the scariest thing in the world, because not only was he painting in the same room, right, and he's this incredible master painter, but I also didn't know what to say, right? And I think that's one of the key things about art is that it is a form of expression. Right? So you first have to figure out what is it that you want to say. And I don't mean that you have to sit there and think, oh, I want to say this sentence. But if you decide to practice it, you have to be in this journey of figuring out that. And you can use the work to help you guide along, which is exactly what I did. And after 5 days of waking up at 5:30 in the morning and being forced to paint or to draw, I realized very quickly that this is what I wanted to do. This was the only thing I wanted to do. So I quit my job, left the relationship. I moved to Japan to be next to my shisha and actually just have this opportunity to paint every day. And he paints on the floor as well. And his beliefs, one of the most important beliefs that I got from him is that the work should be very direct. And by that I mean, like we were discussing before, the stroke has to have a meaning. It has to be embodied an intention. So while I've moved away from some of those very kind of specific elements, I still try, for the color, for the shape, for the process, to be very clear and direct.
And so the painting really starts, it sounds like, with your meditation.
Yes, entirely. I usually sit down to meditate about 20 minutes on average. And this work is very different because I've already started this process, so it's almost like I'm in that same frequency. So I can come back a few days later and stay in that frequency and continue painting. It requires a lot of disconnect from the outside world. So usually when I do this, I don't read books, I don't go to movies. I try to minimize my social life because interacting with humans can be very distracting at times. So I try to stay focused while I do the extent of painting.
Of course, we see something like this, a Westerner immediately thinks of Jackson Pollock, or maybe even looking at this, I'm thinking Robert Motherwell, the elegies. Where so much part of the painting is the act, is the physical interaction with the materials. And they tell me that Jackson Pollock sometimes even has cigarette butts in it. Do you feel any affinity with that?
I do. I mean, Jackson Pollock is a huge inspiration on some levels. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story that I'm not too sure how accurate and true it is, but it's something that I've read and was trying to research. But Jackson Pollock was exposed to a particular Japanese movement called the Gotai. And they were a series of artists who, very early on in their careers, in the early 40s, started to make work, and then they would distribute these pamphlets around the world. And apparently Jackson Pollock had access to one of these. And that's not to discredit Pollock in the way that he kind of invented things and the way that he did his drip paintings, which are incredibly methodical, but also so much about randomness, and they're also so much about his life. And so what I like about Pollock is that everything, he didn't distinguish necessarily moments of painting and moments of living. So when I hear about, the cigarette butts, the spitting, all the things, that he did in the act of painting, it was because his whole life was engulfed in that. There was no separation. And that's something that I'm very interested in, and that's something that's very germane to the Gotay movement. The other part of the Gotay movement that I think has an overlap with Pollock and clearly I try to do is that I try to develop a very particular and unique language that contains the essence of who I am, and it's developed by almost creating a vocabulary or a lexicon that then I continue to apply. And so if you think of Jackson Pollock, right, when people have done those studies on his work, the drips, you can understand that he's actually trying to say something very specific because paintings have the same movement, the same motion. And when you see photos of him painting, he is leaned over, far-reaching on the canvas, and that's the same thing that you can see if you came down to the center and you can see me painting. You would see very kind of similar processes.
What do you see as the final disposition of this marvelous, enormous work?
Well, the painting actually starts here.
Oh.
And it actually will wrap around the space.
Oh my heavens.
So it wraps around all the columns and ends up there. And so this was the first painting that I did, which was on the day of the opening of the exhibition. It was a live performance, and it actually starts with a poem. And the poem, I thought of it as a very kind of funny and uplifting poem, the way that Zen can be humorous sometimes. But the poem basically says, if you die today, it's okay. But if you don't die today, the better. Right? So even in this moment of saying, I have a greater perspective and understanding of life and death, but yeah, we all choose to be alive, right? Like that's still the ultimate goal. And so this particular painting starts with that as a statement. Right? It's almost like a statement of intent. And then it wraps literally around the space as it tells the story.
That's fantastic.
But I want to take you to this one painting that it's a good segue, I think, from this, because now you've seen slightly different work, right? The works on paper, which has so many layers and there's levels of transparency and there's a density. But I want to take you to, and the contrast is that this work is a little bit flatter in the sense that there's maybe 2 or 3 layers. The marks are a lot more bold and very clearly defined. And this is a little bit more in the traditional sense of how I paint. But this painting is probably the best manifestation of that. And it is the last painting before I started doing the live painting. This was the last painting I did in Bali, because all of this work was created in Bali. And I was stuck in the quarantine, not a bad place to be, but nevertheless, dealing with the global pandemic and all of that. This painting is called Lament, and I think you can probably see the similarities between this and the canvas work that we were just describing. This work is really built on these layers of acrylic paint. Once again, this painting was done on the floor for the most part, and in that moment, I lifted it up, added layers, and then brought it back down. So this painting is this accumulation of this movement, maybe 5 or 10 times that goes up and down.
Again, this is canvas now, this is not paper.
Yeah. This is canvas, and so there's, you can see the raw texture of canvas, which is something that I really like. In my work, I don't prime the canvas, and the reason why I don't do that is because it's almost like, I think of it as, this is the fabric of life, right? This is the noise that creates our world, and this is just a snapshot of that. So this painting is called Lament, and it is this, at the end of doing all the other work, I reflected back on how I felt about grieving. And I realized that at the end of the day, I had more lament. And the lament lament is this kind of process in between the regret and then the things that you wish to happen. Right? So the painting itself is almost created in layers. So there's this deeper layer which expresses, and they're the kind of big splashes in these moments where it's the intensity of saying, shit, I wish I would have done these things, right? And then the more subtle and softer layers of certain amount of writing. I tend to write, because the canvas is on the floor, there is no up and down until I finish. So you will see text that is upside down. So in this particular case, it says, "You consume me." And it is both that grief can be very consuming and doesn't let you go, but it also could be in the sense of my love for her consumes me. Right?
To what extent does the text come from the painting, or does the text push the painting?
That is a brilliant question, Larry. I don't know how to answer that, because most of the time the text is a stream of consciousness. I tend to read a lot before I do any painting. Like before I even sit down to paint, before I even have the desire to paint, I will read things. But once I get in the mode of painting, all of that stops. So what comes out is this kind of staccato relationship between references, things that I've heard, things that I've experienced. Text often repeats. So I've made paintings that are called consuming, and then they come back. This is the word everything is written here a few times, and it also appears here. So it's not a conscious decision to say, oh, I'm doing this. It's almost like this repetition of trying to forget something or trying to remember something. So it keeps going back and forth. There's also things that are very interesting for me in this painting. One of them is the thickness of this paint and the texture.
I see.
Which comes from a particular mixture of acrylic. And the difference is also that when this is on the floor, I'm throwing the paint. So the gesture of the paint and this movement kind of changes. So what I do isn't always specific to a pencil or an oil pastel or a brush. I usually try to keep my body engaged in the painting. And then there's the signature thing that we've talked about before, where there's white movement that comes down. It also is above. So those are kind of things that I often do in paintings, which, once again, they're not things that I'm thinking about, they're just kind of automatic expressions.
So how long did this go on as a process?
This particular painting was done over a 4-day period, if I'm not mistaken. But I paint in very short bursts. So I would paint for probably 1 or 2 hours a day. So this painting is about 8 hours long. And the reason why it happens that way is because I'm interested in making the marks and then allowing the space to breathe and allowing the painting to then come back and tell me what it kind of wants to be and how it evolves. And then I add more. Some of it is technical because it needs to dry. But I use that time of the drying to be very reflective about the process and what happens. And you know, the thing is that when even though this painting is done over a series of days, what happens in between the times that I'm in the studio, it's almost like this hibernation of putting it on pause, so that I can come back and dive right back into those emotions. If I continue to fester in the emotion over a period of time, then when I come back to the painting, it's already passed. So that's part of the challenge. I would say that that's a bigger part of the challenge than the scale of the painting or the complexity that it has visually.
Interesting.
The other reason I wanted to talk to you about this painting is because this painting has, the scale of it is very, very particular to me. Maybe it's a kind of a very cheap way of doing it, but I'm so interested in the idea that you get lost in the painting.
Mm-hmm.
That the painting becomes a window into a world. Not necessarily my world, but this is a world of someone who has a deep sense of lament. And so the scale of it, when you kind of sit like we're doing in front of it, it covers your entire field of vision.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you feel like you're falling into the painting. And that is very, very important for me because this is what it feels like in this particular case to have grief.
Mm-hmm.
It colors everything in your world.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that aspect of it. I also like making monumental work because of the impact that it has. And in this particular case, it's this battle between it being repulsive and, shocking and scary,
Mm-hmm.
but then also wanting you to go further and learn and read the text, like struggle to read it, to understand it. So that's a really important part of how I work.
I understand that you worked with our curator, Andrzej Kramarz, to actually make this, fill this particular wall.
Yes.
And that's certainly part of the success of it.
Yeah, I think it was almost, it was very clear to only put one painting in the space so that it actually had the solemnity, is that the word? That it deserves, right? That it makes you reflect. And then having a bench and sitting here and just focusing on one piece, it's about taking that in.
My goodness. I'm thinking that's a good place to leave this. Do you have any parting thoughts you'd like to convey?
Yeah, I would say that the last thing is that grief is a very funny thing because we tend to equate the depth of our sorrow to how much we love someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a very kind of dangerous, it's a very dangerous relationship because we then tend to focus on the sadness, we tend to focus on the loss as opposed to this remembrance and this kind of way that somebody comes into our life and changes us and forms us and become who we are. And I like the idea, I would like to think that when we reflect on loved ones that have passed, we focus more on the joy that they brought us, the happiness, and how they make you feel well after they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's sorrow, and that's largely because we're missing them, but we only miss them because we love them. So for me, the idea of grief is to focus on love, not the sorrow. Which might seem incredibly contradictory to name a show grief and to show a lot of the graphic elements that I've shown. But at least that's my intention. Not too sure I always get there, but that's the intention.
This has been remarkable. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is December 2021. The show will be up through January 2022. And we would love to have people come and see it. And I hope if they see this film, they will get a much deeper understanding of both your work and the sentiments behind it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.